If you grew up in the 1970s, you experienced something no generation before or after ever will. You're the last generation to grow up in a pre-digital, post-war optimism bubble before everything changed. And psychologists are discovering that this unique timing created a psychological profile that's completely different from every generation around you. Let's talk about something that's been overlooked in all the generational psychology discussions. Everyone talks about boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. But there's something uniquely different about people who spent their formative childhood years in the 1970s, roughly born between 1965 and 1975. You grew up in a bizarre cultural moment that was simultaneously optimistic and cynical, free and structured, innocent and aware. And psychology reveals that this contradiction created a generation with remarkable adaptability, realistic optimism, and a cultural literacy that bridges multiple eras in ways that are becoming increasingly valuable. Research from developmental psychology shows that the decade you spend between ages 5 and 15 shapes your psychological baseline more than any other period. These are your formative years when your brain is building its model of how the world works, what's normal, what's possible, and what to expect. If you grew up in the 1970s, your formative years happened during one of the strangest cultural transitions in modern history, the hangover from the 1960s idealism crashing into the harsh economic and political realities of the 1970s, all before the digital revolution changed everything. Here's what makes 70s kids psychologically unique. You grew up in the last era of true unsupervised childhood freedom combined with the first era of widespread cultural awareness of danger. You played outside until dark with no parental oversight, but you also watched news coverage of Watergate, the energy crisis, and economic stagflation. You experienced freedom with an undercurrent of unease. This created what psychologists call cautious independence. You learned to be self-reliant and free-range, but you also learned that the world is complicated and authority figures lie. This combination of freedom and awareness is rare. Let's talk about the specific cultural elements that shaped your psychology. First, you experienced peak analog culture. Rotary phones, vinyl records, broadcast TV with 3 channels, newspapers, libraries. Information was scarce and required effort to access. This built patience, research skills, and the ability to entertain yourself without constant stimulation. Studies show that people who grew up in low-stimulation environments develop stronger internal creative resources and longer attention spans than people raised in high-stimulation digital environments. Here's the economic psychology component. You grew up during stagflation, the weird combination of economic stagnation and inflation that economists said was impossible. Your parents might have had good jobs but felt economic pressure. You watched gas lines during the energy crisis. You experienced an economy that wasn't booming like the 1950s, 60s, or crashing like the 1930s. It was just persistently mediocre and uncertain. Research shows this builds economic realism without catastrophic thinking. You're not naively optimistic like boomers who grew up in post-war prosperity, but you're not cynically pessimistic like those who grew up in the Depression. You're pragmatically adaptable. Research on media influence reveals something fascinating about 70s kids. You're the first generation to grow up with television as a constant presence, but you experienced it before cable fragmentation. Everyone watched the same shows: Sesame Street, The Brady Bunch, Saturday morning cartoons. This created shared cultural literacy that's now extinct. Later generations have fragmented into algorithmic bubbles. You had monoculture, which created strong generational bonding through shared references and experiences. Sociologists note this makes 70s kids excellent cultural translators. You can communicate with older and younger generations because you bridge the analog and early digital divide. Let's talk about the freedom component that defines 70s childhood. You were probably a latchkey kid. You came home from school to an empty house, made your own snacks, entertained yourself, and your parents didn't get home until dinner. This wasn't neglect, it was cultural norm. Research shows that latchkey kids developed strong independence, self-reliance, and problem-solving skills. You learned to manage boredom, handle minor emergencies, and entertain yourself. Child development experts note that modern helicopter parenting has eliminated these developmental opportunities, creating young adults who struggle with independence that you mastered at age 8. Here's the safety paradox. You grew up during what we now know were statistically safer times than today, but it was also when stranger danger awareness exploded. You saw missing children's faces on milk cartons, you learned about kidnapping and safety in ways previous generations didn't, but you also rode bikes without helmets, climbed trees, and explored neighborhoods unsupervised. This created a weird psychological mix, awareness of danger without paralysis from fear. You learned appropriate caution without developing the anxiety that characterizes younger generations raised in constant supervised safety culture. Research on musical and cultural identity reveals that 70s kids had an unusual relationship with music. You experienced the tail end of the 1960s cultural revolution, lived through disco, punk, early hip-hop, and the birth of rock diversity. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was tribal identity. You picked a music culture, and it defined you. Studies show that music preferences formed between ages 12 to 22 remain the most emotionally powerful throughout life. Your formative music was analog. You bought physical albums, listened to entire sides, read liner notes. This created deeper engagement with music than the skip-through streaming culture allows. Let's address the technology transition that makes you unique. You grew up completely analog but adapted to digital in early adulthood. You remember life before computers, VCRs, video games, microwaves, cable TV, and certainly before internet and smartphones. But you were young enough when these technologies emerged to adopt them fluently. Research shows this makes you psychologically flexible. You can function in both analog and digital worlds because you've lived in both. Older generations struggle with digital. Younger generations can't imagine analog. You bridge both completely. Here's the political psychology piece. You grew up during Watergate, the end of Vietnam, the Iran hostage crisis, and general political disillusionment. The 1960s idealism was dead, but Reagan optimism hadn't arrived yet. The 1970s were politically cynical and culturally exhausted. Research shows this created what political psychologists call skeptical engagement. You don't trust institutions or politicians automatically, but you're not completely disengaged either. You're cynical but participatory, which is healthier than naive trust or complete apathy. Studies on resilience and adaptability show that people who grew up in the 1970s score high on both. Why? Because you experienced significant cultural, technological, and economic change during your most formative years.